For almost all of human existence, the body was shaped by a world it could trust. Night meant darkness. Hunger meant scarcity. Cold meant movement. Distance meant effort. The signals were simple, and survival depended on reading them correctly. Yet today, light arrives without sunset, food appears without season, warmth surrounds us without fire, and stillness replaces distance. The body continues to respond as if it were walking across open land, while the ground beneath it has quietly disappeared. What happens to a creature whose senses were designed for one world, but must now live in another? For most of our species' existence, the human body did not live inside walls, under electric light, or surrounded by constant abundance. It lived under an open sky. For tens of thousands of years, and even earlier for our hominin ancestors, survival depended on reading a landscape that changed slowly but decisively with the sun, the wind, and the seasons. The body learned to wake with dawn not because of clocks, but because light itself was a biological signal. It learned to rest after darkness, because night brought risk, cold, and limited visibility. In that long prehistoric span, before agriculture, before cities, before written language, the nervous system was calibrated to patterns that repeated across generations. Those patterns formed the original environment in which the human body was written. Early Homo sapiens, emerging in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, inherited physiological systems shaped by millions of years of evolution before them. Their circadian rhythms aligned with sunrise and sunset. Their metabolism adapted to cycles of scarcity and occasional abundance. Their muscles and joints developed under constant low-intensity movement across varied terrain. Archaeological evidence from hunter-gatherer sites shows no permanent shelter in many regions, but temporary camps that followed migrating animals and seasonal plants. Life unfolded in motion, not in stillness. The climate was not controlled. Temperature shifted from heat to cold within a single day. Rain arrived without warning. Dry seasons demanded travel and planning. The body responded by refining systems for thermoregulation, fat storage, and endurance. Brown adipose tissue, sweating mechanisms, and vascular adjustments were not optional features. They were survival tools. When we look at skeletal remains from Paleolithic humans, we often see markers of repeated physical strain, but also strong bone density shaped by habitual movement. The body expected friction with the environment. It expected variation. Even social life unfolded within constraints that matched neurological capacity. Anthropological studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups, used cautiously as models, suggest social networks rarely exceeded a few dozen close individuals. Trust, threat detection, cooperation, and conflict all operated within scales the brain could process directly. There were no abstract reputations across thousands of strangers, no symbolic hierarchies extending beyond the visible group. The emotional system evolved within this small band structure, where feedback was immediate and personal. Sound carried meaning. A crack in the grass signaled a predator or prey. A change in bird calls indicated movement nearby. Silence at night carried tension. Every sensory input was tied to survival relevance. The nervous system learned to prioritize sudden change because sudden change often meant danger. Over countless generations, this alignment between signal and meaning became deeply embedded. The human body did not evolve in confusion. It evolved in coherence with a world that changed slowly and predictably at the scale of a lifetime. When we trace our origin back to that landscape, we see a biological system designed for responsiveness to natural cycles. Day and night, hunger and satiety, cold and warmth, movement and rest. That original calibration is still present in modern physiology. The question is not whether the body adapted well to its ancient environment. The archaeological record and genetic continuity suggest that it did. The quieter question is what happens when the environment shifts faster than those ancient calibrations can follow. The ancient environment that shaped the human body was not simply a backdrop of trees and open land. It was a system of limits. Food was uncertain. Shelter was temporary. Darkness was absolute once the sun had set. In such a world, the body did not merely exist within nature. It depended on interpreting its boundaries correctly. Energy intake and energy expenditure were closely linked. To eat required movement. To survive cold required activity or shared warmth. There was no steady flow of calories detached from effort. Stable isotope analysis from Paleolithic human remains shows varied diets that shifted with geography and season, indicating flexibility but also constraint. Plants ripened at specific times. Herds migrated along predictable routes. The body's metabolic system developed within this rhythm of fluctuation. Fat storage was advantageous because it bridged gaps between successful hunts and periods of scarcity. Hunger was not an anomaly, it was a recurring signal embedded in life. The hormonal systems that regulate appetite, such as leptin and ghrelin, evolved to respond to a regular supply rather than constant abundance. When the sun moved across the sky, it also structured labor. Morning light increased alertness through hormonal changes linked to cortisol release. As evening approached, melatonin secretion prepared the body for rest. Without artificial illumination, night activity was limited and often risky. Fire extended visibility but did not erase darkness. Anthropological evidence suggests that while controlled use of fire dates back hundreds of thousands of years, it supplemented rather than replaced natural cycles. Sleep likely occurred in segments, influenced by temperature shifts and ambient sound. The architecture of human sleep, including cycles of light and deep stages, reflects adaptation to environments where vigilance and rest had to coexist. The body learned to balance recovery with readiness. Physical movement was not confined to exercise in the modern sense. It was integrated into survival tasks, walking long distances, climbing, carrying, digging, crafting tools. Skeletal morphology of early Homo sapiens shows limb proportions suited for endurance walking and running. The Achilles tendon, expanded gluteal muscles, and efficient sweating mechanisms distinguish our species as one adapted for sustained locomotion in open terrain. These features did not arise in a context of chairs or enclosed spaces. They emerged from landscapes where distance mattered and terrain resisted. The immune system also evolved within exposure. Soil microbes, animal pathogens, and environmental bacteria were part of daily life. Rather than existing in sterile separation, the body calibrated immune responses through constant interaction. Archaeological remains from early settlements after the agricultural transition reveal shifts in disease patterns, suggesting that dense living and domesticated animals altered exposure in significant ways. Yet long before cities, the immune system was already trained by diverse microbial environments. This training shaped inflammatory responses and tolerance thresholds. Even emotional regulation developed under environmental pressures. Fear responses were tuned to immediate physical threats rather than abstract uncertainties. Stress hormones mobilized energy for rapid movement or confrontation. Once the threat passed, physiological systems returned to baseline. The stress response was acute and episodic. It was not designed for prolonged activation across weeks or months. When we consider these interconnected systems, metabolism, sleep, movement, immunity, stress, we see a body aligned with a world of variation and constraint. The origin point of our species was not one of comfort or constant stimulation. It was one of patterned challenge. Every system within us carries traces of that beginning. The deeper question is whether those traces remain compatible with the conditions we now inhabit. For hundreds of thousands of years, the human body did not need to question its surroundings. The signals of the environment were consistent with the needs of survival. Daylight encouraged activity because food gathering and travel were safest when visibility was high. Darkness encouraged stillness because predators, cold, and uncertainty increased when vision diminished. Temperature fluctuated, but the body possessed mechanisms to adapt within a certain range. Rain, wind, and drought demanded flexibility, yet these changes unfolded within seasonal cycles that could be learned and anticipated. Archaeological records from Upper Paleolithic sites reveal tools designed for hunting specific animals at specific times of year, suggesting deep familiarity with ecological rhythms. The body and the environment were not separate systems, they operated as one continuous exchange. Nutritional intake, physical effort, and social cooperation formed a balanced loop. A successful hunt fed the group, strengthened bonds, and justified the energy spent. A failed hunt triggered planning and movement, not endless access to stored food. Even early agricultural communities, emerging around 10,000 years ago, still lived within relatively direct feedback loops. Crop failure meant scarcity. Harsh winters meant reduced stores. The distance between cause and effect remained short enough for the body and mind to interpret consequences clearly. This continuity shaped expectations at a biological level. Hormonal responses were tuned to immediate realities. When physical exertion ended, recovery followed naturally because rest was enforced by darkness or fatigue. When food was consumed, it was often after effort, and digestion unfolded without constant interruption. The gut microbiome developed in relation to fiber-rich plants and minimally processed animal products. Skeletal evidence from early farming populations shows changes in bone structure compared to hunter-gatherers. Yet even then, daily labor remained physically demanding. It is important to notice how recent dramatic environmental shifts truly are. The Industrial Revolution, beginning roughly 250 years ago, introduced artificial lighting, mechanized transport, and large-scale food production. On an evolutionary timescale, this interval represents only a few generations. Genetic adaptation requires extended periods across many reproductive cycles. While small changes can occur relatively quickly under strong selective pressure, most complex physiological systems evolve gradually. The majority of our genome still reflects adaptations to pre-industrial conditions. When we examine this long arc of time, a pattern emerges. The human body evolved in response to environmental signals that were coherent, limited, and tied to survival. It did not evolve for constant abundance, perpetual illumination, or reduced physical demand. It evolved to manage variation and constraint. The coherence between body and world was not perfect, but it was stable enough to sustain our species across diverse climates and continents. From Africa to Eurasia, from open savannas to forested regions, humans carried with them a biological template forged in natural cycles. That template persists. It remains embedded in circadian rhythms, metabolic pathways, stress responses, and musculoskeletal structure. When we consider the question of why modern life may confuse the human body, the answer does not begin in the present. It begins in this long prehistory, where the body learned to trust a world that moved at the pace of sun and season. The next step is to examine how that trust is tested when the environment accelerates beyond those ancient expectations. For most of human history, light had a single source. It rose gradually over the horizon, shifted in color and intensity across the day, and faded into darkness with predictable certainty. The human circadian system evolved within that steady rhythm. Specialized cells in the retina respond not only to images but to light itself, transmitting signals to the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain, which coordinates daily cycles of hormone release, body temperature, and alertness. This internal clock is not an invention of modern science. It is a biological inheritance shaped long before artificial illumination existed. In ancestral environments, sunrise triggered physiological activation. Cortisol levels increased in the early morning, supporting wakefulness and metabolic readiness. As daylight diminished, melatonin secretion gradually prepared the body for sleep. The transition was slow, tied to the natural dimming of the sky. There were no abrupt switches from brightness to darkness. Even the spectrum of natural light shifted from blue-rich tones at midday to warmer hues at sunset, signaling subtle adjustments in alertness. Archaeological evidence from Paleolithic sites suggests that fire was used for warmth and cooking, and likely extended social activity into the evening. Yet firelight is low in intensity and limited in reach. It does not replicate the brightness of modern lighting. The body's evolutionary calibration remained anchored to solar cycles. The introduction of electric light in the late 19th century altered this relationship profoundly. For the first time, night could be made as bright as day. Over the following century, illumination became widespread and constant. Screens now emit blue-enriched light at close range, often during hours that were historically dark. Research in chronobiology demonstrates that exposure to artificial light at night can delay melatonin production and shift circadian timing. This shift may be subtle in the short term, but significant when repeated daily. The body continues to rely on light as a primary signal of time, yet the signal itself has become ambiguous. In ancestral landscapes, light reliably indicated safety for movement and opportunity for food gathering. Darkness indicated caution and rest. Today, brightness no longer guarantees daylight, and darkness no longer arrives with sunset. Urban environments can glow through the night. Indoor spaces remain lit regardless of season. The result is not immediate collapse, but gradual desynchronization. When circadian rhythms drift from external cues, sleep quality can decline, metabolic regulation may shift, and mood patterns can fluctuate. These outcomes are not signs of weakness. They reflect a biological system responding to altered inputs. The origin of this system lies in open landscapes where light was a stable environmental constant. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the body learned to trust the sun as a reliable clock. That trust shaped hormone cycles, gene expression, and daily behavior. The question now is not whether artificial light is useful. It clearly extends productivity and safety in many contexts. The deeper issue is how a body designed for predictable solar variation interprets illumination that no longer follows the sky. When light loses its natural rhythm, the internal clock must either adjust imperfectly or remain slightly misaligned. The effects of that misalignment accumulate quietly, often unnoticed, as modern life continues under brightness detached from sunrise and sunset. In ancestral settings, the relationship between light and activity unfolded gradually across the year as well as across the day. Seasonal variation in daylight length influenced patterns of movement, social gathering, and resource use. In equatorial regions, day length remained relatively stable, while in higher latitudes it expanded and contracted dramatically. As humans migrated out of Africa and dispersed into Eurasia, they encountered these shifting photoperiods. Genetic studies suggest adaptations in skin pigmentation and vitamin D metabolism linked to differing levels of ultraviolet exposure. Yet the fundamental structure of circadian biology remained anchored to solar cues. The body expected light to arrive from above, to change angle and color through the day, and to diminish fully at night. This expectation shaped not only sleep timing but also metabolic processes and cognitive alertness. Modern illumination alters more than brightness. It changes direction, duration, and timing. Light now often comes from overhead fixtures indoors or from screens held inches from the face. The retina's intrinsically photosensitive ganglion cells, particularly sensitive to blue wavelengths, respond strongly to these sources. Studies show that evening exposure to blue-enriched light can suppress melatonin more effectively than warmer light. In natural environments, blue-rich light peaks during midday when the sun is high. Encountering similar wavelengths late at night presents a signal that historically meant daytime. The body cannot easily distinguish between sunlight and digital glow. It interprets photons according to inherited rules. Over time, repeated evening stimulation can shift sleep onset later, shorten total sleep duration, or fragment sleep cycles. Archaeological evidence offers indirect insight into ancient sleep patterns. While we cannot measure Paleolithic sleep directly, ethnographic research among small-scale societies without electric light suggests sleep often begins a few hours after sunset and aligns closely with temperature drops and darkness. These populations typically do not experience the prolonged exposure to artificial light common in industrialized settings. Their circadian rhythms remain tightly coupled to environmental cues. This contrast highlights the speed at which lighting technology has reshaped temporal experience. The Industrial Revolution introduced gas lamps and later electric bulbs, but the widespread presence of screens is a phenomenon of only the past few decades. On an evolutionary timescale, this interval is negligible. The neural circuits governing circadian timing evolved long before such stimuli existed. When night becomes permeable to light, the boundary between rest and activity blurs. Hormonal cascades designed for clear transitions must operate in a landscape of ambiguity. The body continues to rely on light to calibrate internal time, yet the external pattern has grown inconsistent. This does not imply that every exposure produces harm, nor that adaptation is impossible. Humans are flexible within limits. However, flexibility does not equal redesign. The core architecture of circadian regulation still reflects ancient cycles of sunrise and sunset. Each evening, illuminated beyond natural dusk, subtly challenges that architecture. The origin of this system lies in open environments where light served as a stable and trustworthy signal. In the modern world, that signal has multiplied and extended, asking the body to interpret night as something it never historically was. optional. Beyond the daily cycle, light also once signaled something deeper than time. It structured expectation. In ancestral environments, darkness imposed limits that could not be negotiated. Travel became difficult. Hunting ceased. Gatherings slowed. Social interaction narrowed to those within reach of firelight. These constraints did not simply shape behavior. They shaped physiology. The body learned that night would bring reduced activity and lowered metabolic demand. Body temperature typically declines during the night, aligning with decreased movement and caloric intake. In natural settings, this drop was supported by environmental cooling. The internal and external worlds moved in parallel. When artificial light removes darkness but indoor temperature remains constant, this parallel weakens. The body attempts to follow inherited rhythms, even when surroundings suggest continuity rather than pause. Studies of shift workers provide an instructive example. Individuals who work through the night under bright illumination often experience disrupted sleep patterns, altered glucose metabolism, and changes in mood regulation. These outcomes vary across individuals, but the pattern reveals how strongly circadian systems depend on consistent light cues. While shift work is an extreme case, it illustrates the principle that the internal clock expects coherence between light exposure and activity. When that coherence breaks, physiological systems must compensate. The compensation may succeed temporarily, yet it rarely replicates ancestral alignment perfectly. Artificial lighting also extends social and economic activity beyond sunset. Work schedules, entertainment, and communication continue into hours that were historically reserved for rest. The boundary between day and night becomes porous. In urban centers, sky glow can reduce true darkness even outdoors. Satellite imagery demonstrates how brightly lit regions remain visible from space long after midnight. For a species whose biology evolved under stars and moonlight, this represents a profound alteration of sensory context. Darkness once carried informational value. It indicated vulnerability, the need for shelter, and the opportunity for restorative sleep. Removing darkness does not eliminate those biological needs, it only obscures their signals. The origin of human circadian biology lies in millions of years of exposure to the solar cycle. Genetic studies reveal conserved clock genes present not only in humans but in many other organisms, underscoring the deep evolutionary roots of daily rhythms. These genes regulate processes ranging from hormone secretion to cell repair. They assume predictable oscillations in environmental light. When exposure becomes irregular or prolonged, the amplitude and timing of these oscillations can shift. The body is adaptable within certain bounds, yet adaptation requires time and repeated cues. Rapid technological change has outpaced generational adjustment. The nervous system continues to interpret light as a primary environmental message, even when that message now arrives detached from sunrise. This mismatch does not produce a dramatic rupture. It accumulates gradually, night after night, as brightness extends beyond its ancestral role. The question is not whether modern lighting is useful or inevitable. It is how a biological clock, written under ancient skies, interprets evenings that no longer darken in the way they once did. For most of human history, eating was not a continuous background activity. It was an event shaped by effort, uncertainty, and season. In hunter-gatherer societies, food acquisition required tracking animals across distance, gathering plants with knowledge of their timing, and adapting to fluctuations in climate. Stable isotope analysis of ancient human remains shows diets that varied widely depending on geography, yet one pattern remains consistent. Intake was irregular. Periods of abundance followed successful hunts or harvests, but these were often separated by days of reduced caloric access. The human metabolic system evolved within this variability. Energy storage, particularly in the form of body fat, became advantageous because it buffered against unpredictability. Hormones regulating hunger and satiety developed to encourage consumption when food was available and to conserve energy when it was not. In this ancestral context, appetite served survival directly. The transition to agriculture approximately 10,000 years ago introduced greater stability in food supply for some populations, yet even early farming communities experienced seasonal scarcity. Archaeobotanical evidence from early Neolithic sites reveals dependence on a limited number of crops vulnerable to drought, pests, and storage loss. Grain could be preserved, but harvest failures carried immediate consequences. The metabolic expectations shaped in deeper prehistory did not vanish with farming. They persisted within bodies now exposed to somewhat steadier but still constrained supplies. The Industrial Revolution marked a far more rapid shift. Mechanized agriculture, global trade, refrigeration, and later industrial food processing created environments in which calories became consistently accessible, often detached from physical exertion. Refined sugars and concentrated fats entered diets in quantities rarely encountered before. From an evolutionary perspective, this transformation occurred within only a few generations. The physiological systems governing appetite did not undergo parallel redesign. Leptin and ghrelin continue to signal hunger and fullness based on patterns formed in environments where energy scarcity was common. When highly palatable, calorie-dense foods are continuously available, these signals can become difficult to interpret. The body may store surplus energy because it cannot distinguish between temporary abundance and permanent supply. Archaeological and historical data indicate that obesity was rare in pre-industrial populations, though not entirely absent. Its increasing prevalence in modern societies reflects not moral decline, but environmental change. The metabolic architecture of Homo sapiens was shaped across hundreds of thousands of years of fluctuating intake and substantial physical activity. It expects effort to precede reward. It expects meals to be separated by intervals of movement and uncertainty. Modern life often reverses this order. Calories can be obtained with minimal physical demand, at any hour, independent of season. The gut microbiome, which co-evolved with diverse fiber-rich diets, now encounters processed ingredients and reduced microbial exposure. This shift alters microbial composition in ways still under active scientific investigation. What remains clear is that digestion, storage, and energy expenditure systems carry evolutionary memory. They respond according to inherited assumptions about scarcity and effort. When those assumptions no longer match reality, regulation becomes more complex. The question emerging from this contrast is not whether food technology is beneficial. It has reduced famine and increased lifespan in many regions. The quieter inquiry concerns how a metabolism written for irregular abundance interprets a world where abundance has become routine. In ancestral environments, the act of eating was embedded within physical context. Energy intake followed pursuit, gathering, preparation, and sharing. Chewing itself required effort when diets consisted largely of fibrous plants and minimally processed meat. Dental wear patterns observed in fossilized remains of early Homo sapiens and earlier hominins indicate repeated exposure to tough, unrefined foods. Jaw structure and tooth morphology reflect adaptation to substantial mechanical demands. These features developed in response to a diet that rarely delivered concentrated energy without resistance. Even the digestive tract evolved under the assumption that food would arrive in forms requiring breakdown, both mechanical and microbial. The small intestine and colon support nutrient absorption and fermentation, processes influenced by the composition of ingested material. When modern processing reduces fiber content and increases rapidly absorbable carbohydrates, the rate and pattern of glucose entry into the bloodstream changes. Blood sugar can rise more quickly and frequently than in ancestral contexts. Insulin, a hormone essential for regulating glucose, evolved to manage fluctuations tied to episodic meals and sustained physical activity. Continuous exposure to refined carbohydrates presents a pattern historically uncommon. This does not imply that the body cannot adjust at all, but it does mean the regulatory system is responding to inputs outside its original range. Archaeological evidence from early agricultural societies reveals shifts in dental health, including increased caries associated with carbohydrate-rich diets. These findings suggest that even the initial move toward grain-based subsistence altered oral and metabolic environments. The scale and speed of change in the last 2 centuries, however, far exceed those earlier transitions. Industrial refining concentrates sugars and fats into forms that stimulate reward pathways in the brain. Neurobiological research indicates that highly palatable foods can activate dopaminergic circuits involved in motivation and reinforcement. In ancestral settings, such activation likely followed rare energy-dense discoveries, reinforcing behaviors beneficial for survival. When similar stimuli become frequent and easily accessible, the same circuitry operates without the former constraints. The brain continues to interpret sweetness and fat as signals of opportunity. Physical activity once counterbalanced caloric intake. Hunter-gatherer groups studied ethnographically often expend significant energy in daily tasks, even if they do not engage in formal exercise. Skeletal remains display robust muscle attachments consistent with regular movement. Modern lifestyles frequently separate caloric intake from expenditure. Sedentary work reduces baseline energy use, while food availability remains high. The metabolic system attempts to maintain equilibrium through hormonal adjustments, yet sustained surplus can lead to storage beyond immediate need. This dynamic reflects not failure but fidelity to evolutionary design. The body conserves energy because for most of its history, energy was scarce. The microbial communities within the gut, shaped over millennia by diverse plant fibers and environmental exposure, also encounter altered inputs. Reduced dietary diversity and increased processed ingredients influence microbial composition, with potential implications for immune function and inflammation. Scientific understanding of these relationships continues to evolve, yet the direction of change underscores a broader theme. The origin of human metabolism lies in landscapes of unpredictability and effort. Modern food systems, efficient and abundant, operate on principles of consistency and convenience. The resulting interaction is not inherently catastrophic, but it introduces complexity into regulatory systems calibrated for different patterns. The question that emerges is how a digestive and metabolic architecture formed under fluctuating supply interprets a world where effort and energy are no longer tightly linked. For most of our evolutionary history, hunger was a guide rather than a disturbance. It directed attention outward toward landscape and season. It carried information about energy balance in relation to recent effort. When food was found, eating restored equilibrium and often reinforced social bonds through sharing. The cycle was episodic. Between meals, the body relied on stored glycogen and fat, shifting metabolic pathways in response to availability. Research on human metabolism shows that periods without intake activate processes such as lipolysis and, over longer intervals, mild ketosis. These states are not abnormal. They are part of the inherited flexibility that allowed survival across unpredictable environments. In modern settings, constant access to food can compress these cycles. Snacking at frequent intervals reduces time spent in post-absorptive states. The metabolic system remains in a prolonged fed condition, with insulin levels elevated more often than in ancestral contexts. This pattern does not represent moral failure or lack of discipline. It reflects environmental structure. When calories are abundant and visible, appetite cues can be stimulated even in the absence of true energy deficit. Studies in behavioral nutrition indicate that visual exposure to food increases desire to eat, independent of physiological hunger. In prehistoric landscapes, visual exposure typically coincided with real opportunity that required effort to secure. Today, exposure may occur without any physical demand. The architecture of appetite, shaped to seize scarce opportunity, operates within a field of constant cues. Archaeological evidence suggests that while ancient populations experienced nutritional stress, they also engaged in communal eating patterns that reinforced moderation through shared distribution. Food was not always individualized or continuously available. Social context constrained excess, because supply constrained excess. The agricultural revolution increased storage capacity, yet even stored grain required labor to cultivate and process. Industrial food systems, by contrast, detach production from immediate effort for the consumer. This detachment alters the feedback loop between work and nourishment. The body still assumes that energy intake signals future uncertainty, prompting storage. Over extended time, sustained positive energy balance can lead to metabolic strain, including insulin resistance in some individuals. These conditions are widely studied in contemporary medicine and are linked to lifestyle patterns rather than single dietary elements. It is important to avoid oversimplification. Human metabolism is complex and influenced by genetics, environment, and behavior. However, the underlying design reflects adaptation to variability, not permanence. The digestive tract, hormonal regulation, and neural reward circuits evolved to navigate scarcity punctuated by opportunity. They did not evolve in an environment where opportunity is continuous and scarcity rare. This contrast is central to understanding how modern life may confuse the human body. The confusion does not arise because the body is malfunctioning. It arises because the signals it evolved to interpret hunger, taste, energy storage are now amplified and decoupled from their original context. When we trace metabolism back to its origin, in mobile bands of early Homo sapiens, moving across landscapes in search of seasonal resources, we see a system designed for fluctuation. The modern world offers steadiness. The body responds according to ancient logic within a new pattern. The deeper question is how long such a mismatch can persist before regulatory strain becomes common rather than exceptional. For the vast majority of human existence, remaining in one place for long stretches of time was uncommon. Movement was not a scheduled activity, it was the background condition of life. Early Homo sapiens and their hominin ancestors traversed varied terrain in search of water, edible plants, and migratory animals. Fossil evidence reveals skeletal structures adapted for endurance rather than explosive speed. Long lower limbs relative to body size, elastic tendons such as the Achilles, and a highly developed gluteal musculature support sustained walking and running. These traits distinguish humans from other primates more specialized for climbing or short bursts of speed. The landscape itself demanded locomotion. In open savannas and woodland mosaics, distance separated resources. To gather sufficient calories required covering ground daily. Archaeological findings from Paleolithic sites indicate tool transport over considerable ranges, suggesting repeated travel between seasonal camps. Movement was not optional exercise, it was embedded within survival tasks. The cardiovascular system evolved under these demands. Regular low-intensity activity supported circulation, muscle maintenance, and metabolic regulation. The musculoskeletal system strengthened through consistent load-bearing. Bones respond to mechanical stress by increasing density, a principle observed in both ancient remains and modern physiology. Hunter-gatherer skeletons often display robusticity reflecting habitual activity. When agriculture emerged, mobility patterns shifted, but did not disappear. Farming required repetitive labor: planting, harvesting, grinding grain, carrying water. Skeletal remains from early agricultural societies show stress markers consistent with strenuous daily work. Although movement became more localized, it remained integral. Only in the past few centuries has large-scale sedentary living become common. Industrialization introduced machinery that reduced manual labor. Urbanization concentrated populations into built environments where walking distances shortened. In the 20th and 21st centuries, many forms of employment transitioned to seated tasks. Chairs, vehicles, and digital tools further minimized physical demand. From an evolutionary perspective, this transformation is extremely recent. The neuromuscular system retains expectations shaped by millennia of mobility. Muscle fibers adapt quickly to activity levels, but the underlying design presumes regular use. When prolonged sitting replaces habitual movement, circulation slows, muscle engagement decreases, and joint range may narrow over time. Research in exercise physiology suggests that extended sedentary behavior correlates with metabolic changes, including reduced insulin sensitivity and altered lipid profiles. These findings reflect how closely linked movement and metabolism are in human biology. In ancestral contexts, energy intake and energy expenditure were tightly coupled. Food acquisition required effort, and rest followed fatigue or darkness rather than schedule. The absence of movement was temporary and often strategic, such as waiting during a hunt. It was not the dominant posture of the day. The body's architecture, its joint structure, muscle distribution, and cardiovascular capacity was refined within this dynamic balance. Modern sedentary patterns challenge that balance. The confusion arises not because stillness is inherently harmful in short intervals, but because extended inactivity contradicts inherited expectations. When we trace human origins back to landscapes where survival required continual locomotion, we see a species defined by endurance. The question now is how that endurance system interprets a life organized around chairs and enclosed spaces. In ancestral landscapes, movement unfolded across uneven ground, shifting textures, and changing gradients. Walking did not occur on flat, uniform surfaces. It required constant adjustment of balance, foot placement, and muscular coordination. The arches of the human foot, the alignment of the spine, and the intricate network of stabilizing muscles evolved within this variability. Fossil footprints preserved at sites such as Laetoli in Tanzania reveal bipedal gait patterns dating back millions of years, indicating how deeply rooted upright locomotion is in our lineage. This form of movement was not limited to brief episodes. It was sustained across daily routines shaped by terrain. Climbing, crouching, carrying, and lifting form part of the continuous interplay between body and environment. Muscles adapted to multi-directional demands rather than repetitive single-plane actions. The joints of the hips, knees, and shoulders developed to accommodate a wide range of motion. When agriculture intensified, repetitive tasks such as grinding grain or hoeing fields introduced new patterns of strain. Yet even these tasks required standing, bending, and lifting. The body remained in dialogue with gravity and resistance. In contrast, modern sedentary life often confines posture to limited angles for extended durations. Chairs support the body in ways that reduce muscular engagement required for upright stability. Prolonged sitting alters hip flexor length and reduces activation of gluteal muscles that once played a central role in endurance locomotion. Research in biomechanics demonstrates that inactivity can lead to gradual deconditioning, including reduced muscle mass and changes in joint lubrication. Circulatory patterns also shift when the legs remain stationary for long intervals. Blood return from the lower extremities relies partly on muscular contraction, sometimes described as a peripheral pump. When this pump is underused, venous return slows. These physiological responses are not failures, but logical consequences of reduced demand. The evolutionary origin of the human musculoskeletal system lies in constant negotiation with gravity across space. The spine's curvature supports upright stance while allowing flexibility. The pelvis is shaped to balance the torso over the lower limbs. These structural features evolved within conditions where mobility was necessary for survival. Modern built environments, designed for efficiency and comfort, reduce the necessity for such negotiation. Elevators replace climbing, vehicles replace walking, digital communication replaces physical travel. While these innovations increase convenience and productivity, they also alter the feedback loop between movement and internal regulation. Energy expenditure decreases, yet caloric availability often remains high. The nervous system continues to associate movement with exploration and reward, but opportunities for natural locomotion may diminish. Exercise routines attempt to reintroduce movement deliberately, yet they often occur as discrete sessions separated from daily tasks. This separation is historically unusual. For early Homo sapiens, movement was inseparable from life itself. It was not a category, it was context. The modern distinction between activity and rest can create patterns where extended stillness dominates and brief bursts of exercise compensate. The question that emerges is how a body designed for continual varied motion interprets a lifestyle structured around prolonged sitting and controlled environments. The architecture of bones and muscles still carries the imprint of open terrain. The challenge lies in reconciling that imprint with spaces built for efficiency rather than endurance. Beyond muscles and bones, movement also shaped internal regulation in ways less visible but equally significant. In ancestral environments, locomotion influenced circulation, respiration, and even cognition. Walking across open terrain increases heart rate moderately and rhythmically, supporting oxygen delivery to tissues. Over generations, the cardiovascular system adapted to sustain such patterns efficiently. The human heart is proportioned to maintain endurance output rather than brief explosive bursts. Archaeological evidence of long-distance trade in stone tools suggests repeated journeys over many kilometers, reinforcing the idea that sustained mobility was normal rather than exceptional. Movement also modulated metabolism. Muscle contractions facilitate glucose uptake independent of insulin, a mechanism well documented in modern physiology. In environments where daily activity was unavoidable, this pathway operated frequently, helping regulate blood sugar within ranges suited to fluctuating intake. Sedentary behavior reduces these contractions, placing greater reliance on hormonal regulation alone. The system remains functional, yet it was calibrated for a different distribution of effort. Respiration similarly evolved within patterns of steady activity. Endurance walking and running require coordinated breathing synchronized with stride. This rhythmic ventilation supports efficient gas exchange and may influence autonomic balance. Some research suggests that moderate physical activity contributes to regulation of stress responses through effects on the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. In ancestral settings, physical exertion often followed acute stress, such as pursuit or escape, allowing hormonal surges to be metabolized through action. In modern contexts, psychological stress may arise without accompanying movement, leaving physiological activation less directly discharged. This divergence illustrates how movement once served as both cause and resolution of arousal. Cognitive function may also have been intertwined with locomotion. Navigating complex landscapes demanded spatial memory, attention to environmental cues, and anticipation of seasonal patterns. These tasks engage neural circuits linked to the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. While direct archaeological evidence of cognitive processes is limited, tool complexity and migratory patterns imply advanced planning, integrated with mobility. Today, many cognitive demands occur while physically still, often in enclosed spaces. The separation between mental activity and bodily movement is historically recent. The origin of the human nervous system lies in organisms whose survival required coordinated action in space. Over evolutionary time, brain and body co-evolved within that spatial framework. When daily life becomes spatially compressed, with most needs met within short distances, the regulatory systems shaped by mobility encounter altered inputs. This does not mean that sedentary life is inherently incompatible with human biology, but it does suggest that the baseline expectations of circulation, metabolism, and stress modulation included regular movement. The confusion arises when inherited systems continue to anticipate locomotion that no longer occurs naturally throughout the day. The body's architecture remains oriented toward endurance across terrain. Modern spaces prioritize efficiency and comfort. The tension between these orientations forms part of the broader question. How does a species defined by movement interpret a world that asks it to remain still? In your verses, for most of human history, temperature was not a setting. It was a force. The air cooled after sunset, warmed gradually with sunrise, and shifted with wind, rain, and season. The human body evolved within these fluctuations, developing intricate systems to maintain internal stability despite external variation. Thermoregulation became one of the defining features of our species. Unlike many mammals, humans possess a dense network of sweat glands distributed across the skin. This capacity for evaporative cooling supports endurance activity under heat stress. At the same time, vascular adjustments constrict or dilate blood vessels to conserve or release heat as conditions change. Brown adipose tissue contributes to heat production in colder environments. These mechanisms did not emerge in controlled climates. They were forged under unpredictable weather. Archaeological evidence suggests that early Homo sapiens occupied diverse habitats, from African savannas to temperate Eurasian zones. Clothing and shelter gradually extended the range of survivable conditions, yet they did not eliminate exposure. Even with hides, woven fibers, or simple dwellings, temperature variation remained part of daily experience. The body learned to anticipate cooler nights and warmer days. Circadian rhythms interact with thermoregulation, as core body temperature typically declines in the evening to facilitate sleep and rises toward morning. In natural settings, environmental cooling reinforced this internal decline. The alignment between external and internal temperature shifts supported predictable transitions between activity and rest. In modern environments, climate control technologies modify this relationship. Heating systems maintain warmth during winter nights. Air conditioning stabilizes indoor temperatures during summer days. These innovations increase comfort and reduce mortality from extreme weather. However, they also reduce exposure to moderate fluctuations that once signaled time and season. The body continues to adjust blood flow and metabolic rate according to inherited patterns, yet the surrounding air may remain constant. Research in physiology indicates that mild cold exposure can stimulate thermogenic processes and influence metabolic rate. Conversely, prolonged exposure to thermoneutral environments may reduce activation of these adaptive systems. The evolutionary origin of thermoregulation lies in the need to balance heat production and heat loss during movement across variable landscapes. Endurance running under high temperatures required efficient cooling. Rest in colder nights required conservation. The musculoskeletal and cardiovascular systems cooperated with thermoregulatory responses to maintain function. Modern sedentary indoor life changes the distribution of these demands. Physical activity may occur in temperature-controlled gyms rather than under direct sunlight or wind. Sleep may take place in rooms where climate remains steady across seasons. The body's sensory receptors in the skin still detect temperature, yet the range of variation is often narrowed. Seasonal transitions that once altered behavior and diet may now be muted indoors. This does not imply that comfort is harmful. It suggests that the regulatory systems shaped by environmental variability operate within a narrower band of stimuli. The confusion arises when inherited mechanisms continue to expect fluctuation while surroundings offer consistency. The deeper question is how thermoregulatory systems, calibrated across millennia of changing weather, interpret a life spent largely within walls where temperature is chosen rather than encountered. Temperature in ancestral environments did more than challenge comfort. It structured behavior, migration, and even social organization. Seasonal cold encouraged clustering for shared warmth, while seasonal heat influenced patterns of travel and rest. Archaeological records from Ice Age Europe show evidence of shelters positioned to reduce wind exposure and maximize insulation. Yet these structures did not eliminate seasonal variation. Animal hides, layered garments, and controlled fire provided protection, but daily life still unfolded within a dynamic thermal landscape. The body's thermoregulatory responses were continuously engaged. Vasoconstriction in cold weather redirected blood toward vital organs. Shivering generated heat through involuntary muscle contraction. In warmth, vasodilation and sweating facilitated cooling. These processes require energy and interact with metabolic rate. Exposure to varying temperatures may have contributed to metabolic flexibility, reinforcing the link between environment and energy balance. As humans expanded into diverse climates, natural selection favored traits that supported survival in local conditions. Skin pigmentation adapted in response to ultraviolet radiation levels, balancing vitamin D synthesis and protection against excessive exposure. Body proportions in different populations reflect principles such as Bergmann's and Allen's rules, where shape and surface area relate to heat retention or dissipation. These adaptations unfolded over thousands of years, demonstrating the gradual pace of evolutionary change. By contrast, the widespread adoption of climate control systems occurred within a few generations. Central heating and air conditioning buffer indoor spaces from seasonal extremes. Modern buildings often maintain temperatures within a narrow comfort zone throughout the year. This stabilization reduces thermal stress and has clear public health benefits, including lower mortality during heat waves and cold spells. Yet the physiological systems designed to respond to fluctuation remain intact. Research suggests that mild thermal stress can activate adaptive pathways, including changes in brown fat activity and vascular responsiveness. When exposure to variation diminishes, these pathways may become less frequently engaged. The body does not cease to regulate temperature, it simply does so within a narrower range. Sleep architecture also interacts with thermal environment. Studies indicate that cooler ambient temperatures in the evening can facilitate sleep onset by supporting the natural decline in core body temperature. In ancestral settings, nightfall typically brought cooling air. In climate-controlled bedrooms, this external signal may be altered or delayed. The synchronization between environmental cues and internal rhythms becomes subtler. The origin of human thermoregulation lies in an open world where weather could not be adjusted. Adaptation required responsiveness rather than control. Modern comfort technologies invert this relationship by allowing humans to adjust surroundings to suit preference. The evolutionary timeline, however, has not rewritten the body's core expectations. It continues to operate as if fluctuation is normal and constancy unusual. The question that follows is how these inherited responses interpret a life largely insulated from seasonal contrast. Does reduced variation simply represent progress, or does it subtly reshape the calibration of systems evolved to anticipate change? Temperature once marked the passage of time in ways that extended beyond comfort or discomfort. It signaled seasonal shifts that structured food availability, reproduction, and migration. In many regions, colder months limited plant growth and altered animal movement patterns. Warmer months expanded dietary options and encouraged travel. These fluctuations created predictable cycles that the human body could anticipate. Hormonal patterns often reflect seasonal variation, with some evidence suggesting modest shifts in reproductive timing and immune activity across different climates. While such patterns vary by geography and culture, they underscore how deeply embedded environmental rhythm once was in daily life. The body's thermal regulation does not function in isolation. It interacts with metabolism, sleep, and immune response. Mild cold exposure can increase thermogenic activity and influence energy expenditure. Heat exposure can alter hydration needs and cardiovascular workload. In ancestral environments, these exposures were not extreme at all times, but they were regular enough to maintain adaptability. The immune system, too, evolved under conditions where seasonal crowding and dispersal influenced pathogen transmission. Winter clustering may have increased exposure to certain infections, while summer dispersion reduced contact density. These ecological patterns shaped population-level disease dynamics long before modern medicine. Climate control technology has reduced mortality from extreme temperatures, a significant achievement in public health. Yet it also dampens environmental cues that once synchronized physiology with season. Indoor heating in winter and cooling in summer create a relatively stable microclimate. The body continues to adjust core temperature daily, but the amplitude of seasonal variation may decrease when exposure narrows. Research on environmental enrichment suggests that exposure to moderate natural variability can support resilience across biological systems. The absence of such variability does not necessarily produce immediate harm, but it may reduce opportunities for adaptive engagement. From an evolutionary perspective, humans developed flexibility precisely because conditions were not constant. The thermoregulatory system evolved to manage gradients rather than flat lines. When surrounding temperature remains nearly unchanged throughout the year, internal rhythms may still oscillate, but external reinforcement weakens. Seasonal affective patterns observed in some populations illustrate how light and temperature together influence mood and energy. Although these patterns are complex and influenced by multiple factors, they highlight the interplay between environment and physiology. The deeper theme returns to origin. Early Homo sapiens lived within climates that demanded responsiveness to heat and cold. Shelter and clothing mitigated extremes, yet they did not erase them. The body learned to expect variation and to adjust accordingly. Modern life offers insulation from many environmental challenges, often with clear benefits. However, insulation also narrows the range of stimuli that once guided regulation. The confusion arises not from comfort itself, but from the subtle decoupling of internal cycles from external change. When temperature ceases to mark season clearly, the body must rely more heavily on internal cues alone. The question becomes whether systems shaped by fluctuation interpret this steadiness as relief or as an absence of signals they once depended upon. For most of human history, sound carried immediate meaning. A sudden crack in dry grass could signal a predator. The rhythmic call of birds might indicate normalcy in the environment. The rush of wind or the approach of distant thunder provided information necessary for survival. In ancestral landscapes, the auditory system evolved to prioritize sudden changes and directional cues. The human ear is sensitive to variations in frequency and timing that allow rapid localization of sound sources. This sensitivity reflects adaptation to environments where misinterpreting a noise could have serious consequences. Silence, too, held information. An abrupt absence of background animal calls might indicate danger nearby. In small hunter-gatherer bands, vocal communication was direct and contextual. Speech emerged within limited social groups where tone and proximity conveyed nuance. Archaeological evidence does not preserve sound, yet the structure of ancient settlements suggests relatively low ambient noise compared to modern cities. Camps were temporary, populations small, and mechanical noise non-existent. The nervous system calibrated itself to acoustic environments characterized by natural variation and meaningful signals. Modern urban life presents a different auditory landscape. Traffic, machinery, electronic notifications, and constant background hum create a field of sound often detached from immediate survival relevance. Research in environmental health indicates that chronic exposure to high levels of noise can influence stress responses, including elevated cortisol and increased heart rate. Even when noise is not consciously interpreted as threatening, the autonomic nervous system may register it as arousal. This response traces back to evolutionary priorities. Sudden or unpredictable sound historically required attention and readiness. In contemporary settings, many sounds are repetitive and non-threatening, yet they still engage perceptual systems tuned for vigilance. The result may be subtle but persistent activation. The contrast extends beyond volume. Natural soundscapes contain patterns shaped by ecological processes. Wind varies, water flows irregularly, animal calls shift with time of day. These patterns may support a sense of environmental coherence. Some studies suggest that exposure to natural sounds can promote relaxation and reduce perceived stress, though mechanisms remain under investigation. What is clear is that the auditory system evolved in relation to specific types of stimuli. Mechanical and electronic sounds, while not inherently harmful, differ in frequency, composition, and repetition. They may lack the layered variability of natural environments. The origin of human hearing lies in open spaces and small communities where sound carried proportionate meaning. When a branch snapped, attention sharpened. When night grew quiet, vigilance increased. Modern acoustic environments often blur the distinction between signal and background. Continuous low-level noise can mask meaningful cues while amplifying non-essential ones. The body's stress response, shaped to mobilize briefly in the face of threat, may activate in response to stimuli that never resolve into action. This does not imply that cities are incompatible with human biology, but it suggests that auditory systems continue to operate according to ancient rules. The question that emerges is how a nervous system designed for sparse, meaningful sound interprets a world filled with constant layered noise. In ancestral environments, sound rarely existed as an isolated layer detached from context. It was embedded within visible landscape, smell, and movement. A rustling in tall grass carried meaning because it occurred within a specific place, at a specific time of day, often accompanied by other sensory cues. The brain integrated these inputs to form rapid judgments about safety or opportunity. The auditory cortex and limbic system evolved in close coordination, allowing emotional responses to arise quickly from acoustic signals. This coordination was adaptive in environments where delay could be costly. Sudden noise triggered orienting responses, head turning, increased heart rate, heightened attention. Once the source was identified and assessed as harmless, arousal subsided. The pattern was acute and self-limiting. In modern environments, sound often arrives without visible source or clear resolution. Mechanical hums persist for hours. Electronic notifications interrupt without corresponding physical event. Sirens, alarms, and traffic create fluctuating intensities detached from personal survival. Research in neurobiology suggests that repeated exposure to unpredictable noise can sustain low-level activation of stress pathways. Even when individuals report habituation, physiological markers such as blood pressure may remain slightly elevated in chronically noisy settings. This does not imply that all modern sound is damaging, but it highlights how regulatory systems shaped for episodic arousal interpret persistent stimulation. The scale of social sound has also expanded. Early Homo sapiens likely lived in groups small enough that most voices were familiar. Vocal recognition carried social meaning tied to cooperation and kinship. Today, individuals may encounter hundreds of unfamiliar voices daily, in person or through media. The auditory system processes speech patterns rapidly, yet it evolved within intimate acoustic communities. Continuous exposure to layered conversations, recorded media, and amplified music represents a novel condition in evolutionary terms. Archaeological evidence of ancient dwellings suggests structures that absorbed or diffused sound naturally through organic materials. Open-air living spaces allowed noise to dissipate into surrounding landscape. Modern architecture, particularly in dense urban settings, can reflect and amplify sound. The acoustic ecology shifts from sparse and directional to dense and overlapping. Some research indicates that exposure to natural soundscapes, such as flowing water or rustling leaves, may support parasympathetic activity, promoting calm states. The mechanisms remain under study, but they point toward an alignment between auditory pattern and physiological regulation. When sound lacks clear beginning and end, the nervous system may struggle to interpret whether vigilance is necessary. The evolutionary origin of auditory sensitivity lies in survival within open terrain where each sound carried proportionate meaning. The body learned to escalate and then de-escalate in response to acoustic change. In a world where noise rarely ceases and signals rarely resolve into action, escalation may occur without full resolution. The deeper question becomes how a system tuned for meaningful fluctuation navigates an environment saturated with continuous, ambiguous sound. Sound once marked transitions in the day and reinforced boundaries between states of activity and rest. At dusk, animal calls shifted, insects emerged, wind patterns changed with cooling air. These auditory cues accompanied visual dimming and falling temperature, creating a multisensory signal that night had begun. The body's internal rhythms align not only with light, but with the acoustic environment. Quiet intervals during the night reduce sensory input, allowing deeper phases of sleep. When unexpected noise occurred, it typically demanded attention because it carried potential threat. Once assessed, the body returned to rest. The pattern of vigilance and recovery was woven into the architecture of sleep itself. Modern acoustic environments often blur this pattern. Urban areas rarely become fully quiet. Even in indoor spaces, appliances, ventilation systems, and distant traffic produce continuous background sound. While some of this noise may fall below conscious awareness, the auditory system remains active during sleep. Research in sleep science shows that sudden sounds can trigger microarousals, brief shifts in brain activity that fragment sleep without fully awakening the individual. Over time, repeated microarousals may reduce sleep depth and continuity. The evolutionary origin of this sensitivity lies in survival value. A sleeping human in an open landscape needed to respond to unusual sound quickly. The threshold for arousal was set accordingly. In modern bedrooms, the same threshold persists, even when most nocturnal sounds are harmless. The scale of social and technological sound further complicates this dynamic. Electronic devices may emit alerts at any hour. Notifications and media can extend engagement into the night, delaying sleep onset. The auditory system, shaped to interpret sound as immediate information, cannot easily categorize digital tones as biologically irrelevant. The brain processes them through pathways that evolved long before such stimuli existed. This does not mean that all sound disrupts sleep equally. Consistent, low-level noise may be filtered over time, while irregular spikes provoke stronger responses. White noise devices are sometimes used to mask unpredictable sounds, illustrating how structured acoustic input can influence perception and arousal. The broader theme remains one of mismatch. Early Homo sapiens rested within environments where sound signaled proportionate meaning and where extended silence was common. The nervous system balanced alertness and recovery within that framework. Modern life introduces constant acoustic presence, reducing intervals of true quiet. Even if individuals adapt psychologically, the physiological systems underlying vigilance continue to operate according to inherited rules. The body does not know that traffic is unlikely to enter the bedroom. It knows only that abrupt noise historically required readiness. When sound loses clear boundaries and persists beyond natural cycles, the line between vigilance and rest becomes less distinct. The question that follows is how a species shaped by nights filled with stars and intermittent natural sound interprets a world where silence itself has become rare. For most of human existence, social life unfolded within small, stable groups. Anthropological research suggests that early hunter-gatherer bands often consisted of a few dozen individuals who knew one another intimately. Cooperation was direct, reputation was local, conflict occurred face to face. The human brain evolved within this scale. Neural circuits supporting social cognition, empathy, and threat detection developed in environments where the number of meaningful relationships remained limited. The concept sometimes referred to as Dunbar's number proposes a cognitive threshold for stable social ties, often estimated around 150 individuals, though actual social networks in ancestral contexts were likely smaller and fluid. Archaeological evidence of campsite size and burial practices indicates repeated interaction within tight-knit groups. In such settings, social signals were immediate and personal. A raised voice carried direct consequence. A gesture signaled alliance or tension. Emotional responses were shaped by visible feedback. The amygdala and prefrontal cortex coordinate responses to social threat and reward. In small groups, these responses could resolve quickly because information was localized. When disagreement occurred, resolution required proximity. There were no distant observers or abstract audiences. Modern societies expand social scale dramatically. Urban populations number in the millions. Digital networks connect individuals across continents. The human brain, however, retains architecture forged in smaller communities. It must process faces, voices, and reputations at a scale unprecedented in evolutionary history. Social media platforms amplify this expansion, presenting streams of unfamiliar individuals' opinions and evaluations. The stress response may activate not only in physical danger but in perceived social evaluation. Research in social neuroscience indicates that exclusion or negative feedback can trigger neural patterns similar to physical pain. In ancestral environments, social exclusion carried survival risk because group membership ensured protection and resource sharing. Today, social cues may arise from distant or anonymous sources, yet emotional circuitry responds according to inherited logic. The distinction between immediate and abstract social threat becomes blurred. Archaeological transitions from small bands to larger agricultural villages introduced new social dynamics, including hierarchy and specialization. Yet, even early villages remained small compared to modern cities. Face-to-face interaction still dominated. The scale of modern bureaucratic states and global communication systems exceeds ancestral templates by orders of magnitude. The body and brain interpret social information through systems calibrated for intimacy and directness. When information arrives from thousands of strangers, evaluation mechanisms may remain active without clear resolution. Social comparison, once limited to nearby peers, can now extend to global audiences. The confusion arises not because human sociability is flawed, but because its design reflects a world of manageable size. Early Homo sapiens navigated alliances and rivalries within visible networks. Their emotional systems evolved to support cohesion in groups small enough to track. Modern life expands the field dramatically. The question is how a nervous system built for small-scale cooperation interprets a social world that rarely pauses and rarely narrows to the size of a single campfire circle. In small ancestral groups, social roles were visible and grounded in daily necessity. Skill in tracking, gathering, tool-making, or healing carried clear value because it contributed directly to survival. Hierarchies, where present, were often fluid and context-dependent rather than rigid and abstract. Anthropological observations of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, used carefully as partial models, suggest leadership frequently emerged through competence and reciprocity rather than permanent authority. Reputation formed through repeated interaction within a limited circle. The human brain adapted to monitor fairness, cooperation, and trust within these scales. Neural systems involved in reward processing respond strongly to social approval and reciprocal exchange, reinforcing behaviors that sustain group cohesion. In such settings, feedback loops were immediate. Praise or criticism came from individuals known personally. Modern societies introduce layers of abstraction. Occupational roles may not connect visibly to survival. Authority can operate at institutional levels far removed from daily life. Reputation may depend on digital metrics or distant evaluation rather than direct encounter. The brain's social circuitry continues to respond to signals of status and approval, yet the signals themselves have multiplied and detached from local context. Research in social psychology indicates that social comparison intensifies when individuals are exposed to large, diverse groups. In ancestral environments, comparison occurred within narrow ranges of age, skill, and circumstance. Today, comparison spans continents and cultural boundaries. The emotional system, shaped to evaluate standing within a tribe, must process information from audiences far beyond ancestral scale. Archaeological evidence from early agricultural communities reveals increasing social stratification. Yet even complex ancient cities, such as those in Mesopotamia or Mesoamerica, were limited in population compared to modern metropolises. Communication relied on direct interaction or slow transmission through writing. The velocity and volume of social information remained constrained. In contemporary life, digital platforms compress time and space. Feedback can arrive instantly and persist indefinitely. The stress response associated with social evaluation, once acute and tied to immediate survival, may now extend over longer durations. Studies have linked chronic social stress to physiological markers, including altered cortisol rhythms and inflammatory responses. These associations underscore how deeply social context intertwines with bodily regulation. The origin of human sociability lies in environments where cooperation ensured protection and shared resources. Emotional attunement to group opinion was adaptive because exclusion could mean vulnerability. That adaptive sensitivity remains embedded in neural circuitry. When social networks expand beyond manageable size and evaluation becomes continuous, inherited mechanisms may remain active without clear resolution. This does not imply that modern social systems are inherently damaging. They offer unprecedented connection and collaboration. It suggests that the architecture of the human brain continues to operate according to ancient parameters. The tension arises when systems designed for intimate networks must navigate vast, persistent audiences. The deeper question becomes how a species whose emotional regulation evolved around face-to-face interaction interprets a social world that rarely narrows to direct human presence. In ancestral communities, social tension carried immediate boundaries. Disagreement unfolded within shared physical space, and resolution required proximity. Conflict could not easily be avoided, but it also could not be sustained indefinitely without consequence. The emotional systems that respond to social threat evolved within this context of visibility and closure. When reconciliation occurred, it often involved direct gestures, shared labor, or communal ritual. The physiological stress response activated in the presence of conflict and subsided once resolution was achieved. The loop between arousal and recovery was short, tied to tangible events. In modern societies, social interaction frequently extends beyond physical presence. Communication occurs through written messages, recorded media, and digital platforms. These channels allow interaction across distance, but they also permit unresolved tension to persist. A message can be reread, reinterpreted, or publicly circulated long after the original exchange. The brain's social circuits, including regions involved in threat detection and emotional memory, do not easily distinguish between immediate and mediated encounters. Research in affective neuroscience suggests that social rejection or criticism can activate neural pathways similar to those involved in physical pain. In ancestral settings, such pain signaled risk to survival because isolation reduced access to shared resources. Today, the context has shifted, yet the circuitry remains responsive. The scale of modern institutions further extends social exposure. Employment structures, educational systems, and bureaucratic organizations introduce layers of evaluation often detached from personal familiarity. Performance reviews, standardized assessments, and public metrics create feedback mechanisms that operate without direct relational grounding. While these systems can promote accountability and coordination across large populations, they also expand the field of perceived scrutiny. The human nervous system, calibrated for recognition within a limited group, may interpret broad evaluation as continuous vigilance. Archaeological evidence from early complex societies shows that hierarchy and administration increased gradually over millennia. However, the magnitude and speed of social connectivity in the last century surpassed previous transitions. Global communication networks compress time zones and dissolve geographic barriers. Social information circulates continuously. Emotional regulation systems shaped for cyclical interaction must operate within this constant flow. It is important to acknowledge that modern social structures also provide unprecedented opportunity for collaboration and cultural exchange. The issue is not expansion itself, but the pace at which it has occurred relative to biological adaptation. Evolutionary change unfolds across many generations. The architecture of social cognition remains rooted in environments where group size and communication speed were constrained by physical proximity. When evaluation becomes diffuse and persistent, the stress response may not receive clear signals for deactivation. The deeper theme returns to origin. Early Homo sapiens navigated alliances and rivalries around shared fires within landscapes where each voice was known. The emotional systems forged in that intimacy continue to guide responses today. The question becomes how those systems interpret a social world that extends far beyond the boundaries of ancestral camps. For most of human existence, time was not measured in uniform units. It was experienced through cycles. The rising and setting of the sun marked the day, the waxing and waning of the moon marked longer intervals. The migration of animals, the ripening of plants, and the arrival of rains mark the seasons. Early Homo sapiens did not live within linear schedules extending indefinitely into the future. They lived within repeating patterns that returned each year. Archaeological evidence from Upper Paleolithic sites shows seasonal occupation of certain regions, suggesting mobility structured around ecological rhythms. Camps were established when resources were abundant and abandoned when they declined. Time, in this context, was circular and embedded in landscape. The human brain evolved within these cycles. Circadian rhythms synchronized daily activity to light and darkness. Longer biological rhythms, including hormonal variations and reproductive timing, aligned with seasonal changes in environment. While human reproduction is not strictly seasonal in the way it is for some animals, historical data indicates subtle fluctuations in birth rates across different climates and agricultural societies. These patterns reflect how environmental variation can influence physiology indirectly through food supply and social structure. The agricultural revolution began to formalize time around planting and harvest, yet even then, schedules followed ecological constraint. Planting too early or too late carried immediate consequence. The calendar emerged as a tool to track natural cycles rather than replace them. Only in the modern era has time become standardized and abstracted from environment. Mechanical clocks divided the day into precise segments independent of sunrise. Industrialization intensified this abstraction. Factory shifts required punctuality regardless of season or daylight. Artificial lighting extended work hours beyond natural boundaries. 2.5. Time zones synchronized distant regions under uniform systems. The pace of life accelerated as transportation and communication technologies reduced travel time and increased exchange. From an evolutionary perspective, this compression is recent. The nervous system still interprets time through biological rhythms rooted in cycles rather than continuous acceleration. Research in chronobiology indicates that disruption of natural temporal cues can affect sleep, mood, and metabolic regulation. Jet lag, for example, illustrates how rapidly shifting time zones challenge circadian alignment. Although the body can gradually adjust, the process requires repeated exposure. When daily life maintains a constant schedule year-round, independent of seasonal variation, internal rhythms may lose external reinforcement. In ancestral contexts, winter brought shorter days and longer nights, often accompanied by reduced activity. Summer extended daylight and altered patterns of movement and diet. These shifts were not optional, they were dictated by environment. Modern indoor life can mute these seasonal signals. Work and school schedules may remain unchanged across months. Climate control stabilizes temperature. Artificial light maintains brightness in winter evenings. The origin of human temporal perception lies in environments where time returned upon itself, marked by visible change in sky and soil. The deeper question is how a biology shaped by cyclical expectation interprets a world organized around linear productivity and uninterrupted schedules. In ancestral settings, the experience of time was inseparable from visible transformation in the environment. The lengthening of shadows in late afternoons signaled the approach of evening. The gradual cooling of air reinforced that signal. Seasonal changes unfolded through shifts in vegetation, animal movement, and daylight duration. These cues were not abstract. They were embodied. The body adjusted appetite, sleep, and activity in response to signals that arrived through sight, temperature, and availability of resources. Even early agricultural societies, though more settled, remained tightly bound to seasonal cycles. Archaeological records from ancient farming communities reveal storage pits filled after harvest and emptied gradually through winter. Labor intensity peaked during planting and reaping, then eased in colder months. Time retained texture and contrast. It expanded and contracted in rhythm with the land. The industrial era introduced a different temporal structure. Clocks regulated work independent of sunrise. Artificial light reduced the practical significance of dusk. Over time, global coordination required standardized time zones and precise scheduling. The human nervous system, however, continues to operate through internal oscillators shaped by cyclical reinforcement. Circadian rhythms depend on repeated daily cues. Seasonal rhythms, though subtler in humans than in some species, still influence patterns of mood and energy in many populations. Research on seasonal affective patterns indicates that reduced daylight exposure during winter months can affect neurotransmitter regulation and sleep timing in susceptible individuals. This suggests that environmental variation continues to interact with internal timing mechanisms. Modern life often dampens this variation. Indoor work limits exposure to natural daylight fluctuations. Climate control stabilizes temperature across seasons. Year-round availability of diverse foods reduces dietary shifts tied to harvest cycles. The calendar persists, but its relationship to ecological constraint weakens. From an evolutionary perspective, the body anticipates contrast. It expects periods of intensity, followed by periods of rest. In hunter-gatherer contexts, travel might intensify during resource-rich seasons and decline during scarcity. Even within agricultural systems, winter provided a relative pause compared to harvest time. Contemporary economic systems, in contrast, often maintain consistent demand and productivity throughout the year. Work schedules rarely adjust significantly to seasonal light variation. The internal clock must maintain regularity without the strong external cues that once synchronized it. Studies in chronobiology demonstrate that exposure to natural light patterns can strengthen circadian alignment. Conversely, limited daylight exposure and extended artificial illumination may blur temporal boundaries. The deeper issue is not whether linear timekeeping is harmful. It has enabled coordination across vast societies. The question is how a species whose biology evolved under repeating cycles interprets a temporal framework that emphasizes continuity and acceleration rather than return. Early Homo sapiens moved through landscapes that reminded them daily and seasonally of change. Modern environments often reduce visible markers of transition. The body's internal rhythms continue to oscillate, yet the external world may no longer mirror their cadence as clearly as it once did. In environments where time was marked by visible cycles, anticipation carried a different quality. The return of certain fruits signaled abundance. The approach of winter signaled preparation. These transitions were not arbitrary deadlines but ecological necessities. Human planning evolved within that framework. Memory and foresight supported survival because they were tied to recurring patterns. The hippocampus, a brain structure involved in spatial memory and temporal sequencing, developed in organisms navigating landscapes where season and location intertwined. Archaeological evidence of storage, such as pits for preserved food or caches of tools, suggests that early humans anticipated future scarcity based on repeated experience. Planning extended weeks or months ahead, but it remained grounded in environmental rhythm. In modern societies, planning often extends years or decades into abstract futures. Educational systems prepare individuals for careers not yet defined. Financial structures project decades forward. The concept of retirement assumes a lifespan and economic stability historically rare. While such planning reflects technological and social advancement, it also introduces temporal abstraction beyond ancestral precedent. The stress response, shaped to manage near-term uncertainty, may engage when confronted with distant possibilities. Research in psychology indicates that chronic anticipation of long-term pressure can sustain physiological arousal even without immediate threat. In ancestral contexts, uncertainty existed, yet it was tied to tangible variables such as weather, migration patterns, or intergroup relations. When resolution occurred, it was visible. Modern uncertainty can be diffuse and prolonged, spanning economic markets, global events, or digital reputation. The internal clock continues to regulate daily and seasonal rhythms, but the cognitive layer of temporal awareness has expanded dramatically. Work weeks divide life into standardized segments detached from seasonal variation. Deadlines cluster without relation to daylight or harvest. The body experiences fatigue according to circadian timing. yet social obligations may override those signals. Over time, repeated misalignment between biological rhythm and imposed schedule can influence sleep and mood patterns. Chronotype research shows individual variation in preferred sleep timing, yet societal schedules often favor uniformity. This tension illustrates how linear time structures can override inherited diversity. The origin of human temporal perception lies in recurring natural sequences that returned reliably. Time once felt circular because the environment repeated itself. Modern life introduces forward momentum as a central theme. Progress, growth, and productivity emphasize accumulation rather than return. The body, however, continues to oscillate in cycles. Heartbeats, breaths, hormonal pulses. These rhythms reflect evolutionary continuity. When external structures emphasize constant forward motion without pause, the internal expectation of rest and renewal may lack reinforcement. The confusion arises not from progress itself, but from the divergence between cyclical biology and linear organization. Early Homo sapiens lived within seasons that closed and reopened each year. The modern individual lives within calendars that rarely reset. The deeper question is how a physiology shaped by repetition interprets a world that measures time as an ever-advancing line. For most of human evolution, information arrived slowly and directly. Knowledge was gathered through observation of landscape, tracking of animals, recognition of plants, and memory of seasonal change. Communication occurred face-to-face, through speech, gesture, and shared experience. The volume of new information within a single day was limited by physical proximity and environmental variation. Early Homo sapiens did not awaken to global events or distant opinions. They awoke to the immediate conditions of their surroundings. The nervous system evolved within this scale of input. Sensory processing systems prioritized novelty because novelty often signaled opportunity or threat. Attention shifted towards sudden movement, unfamiliar sound, or unexpected change in weather. Once interpreted, attention returned to baseline. The architecture of the brain reflects this pattern. The prefrontal cortex supports focused decision-making within manageable streams of stimuli. The limbic system responds to emotionally salient events that require rapid evaluation. In ancestral contexts, the number of simultaneous stimuli was constrained by ecology. Information density rose and fell with social gathering, hunting, or environmental challenge, but it did not persist at maximal levels continuously. Archaeological evidence suggests gradual accumulation of knowledge across generations, visible in increasingly complex tools and symbolic artifacts. Yet transmission remained limited by memory and oral tradition. Writing, which emerged only a few thousand years ago, expanded the capacity to store and transmit information. Still, the pace of change remained slow compared to contemporary standards. The printing press accelerated dissemination, and later electronic media multiplied reach. In the digital era, information flows at unprecedented speed and volume. Individuals may encounter news from multiple continents within minutes of waking. Social media streams present continuous updates, images, and opinions. Notifications interrupt tasks with new content regardless of immediate relevance. The brain's attentional systems, shaped to respond to intermittent novelty, now face near constant stimulation. Research in cognitive science suggests that sustained exposure to rapid, high-density information can fragment attention and increase perceived cognitive load. While the human brain is adaptable, it operates within limits established by evolutionary history. The dopaminergic pathways that reinforce learning and exploration respond to unpredictable rewards. In ancestral settings, discovering food or useful knowledge activated these pathways intermittently. In digital environments, variable rewards may appear repeatedly through likes, messages, or updates. The circuitry remains the same. The frequency of activation changes. The origin of human cognition lies in small groups, navigating complex but bounded landscapes. Information was relevant because it related directly to survival or cooperation. Modern information ecosystems expand relevance far beyond immediate context. The confusion arises not because humans are incapable of processing large amounts of data, but because the rate and persistence of input exceed ancestral patterns. The body and brain continue to interpret novelty as meaningful. When novelty becomes continuous, the distinction between signal and background narrows. The question that follows is how a mind, designed for intermittent discovery, interprets a world where discovery never pauses. In ancestral environments, attention moved with purpose. When a hunter tracked footprints across dry soil, focus narrowed to subtle variations in shape and direction. When a gatherer searched for edible plants, visual scanning prioritized color, texture, and memory of location. Attention was selective because it needed to be. Divided focus could result in missed cues with real consequences. The brain evolved mechanisms to filter sensory input and allocate cognitive resources toward immediate tasks. The anterior cingulate cortex and prefrontal regions coordinate this allocation, supporting sustained attention when required and allowing disengagement when threat subsides. These systems developed in landscapes where the number of simultaneous stimuli was limited by physical reality. Modern information systems alter this constraint. Multiple streams of input compete for awareness. Messages, news updates, advertising, and digital conversations. The architecture of many platforms is designed to capture and retain attention through intermittent reinforcement. Cognitive research suggests that task switching carries measurable costs. When attention shifts repeatedly between stimuli, performance on complex tasks can decline. This effect does not imply that human attention is weak. It indicates that neural resources are finite. In ancestral contexts, switching attention from one task to another often occurred in response to genuine environmental change. A sudden sound might interrupt gathering, but once assessed, focus returned to the original task. In digital contexts, interruptions may occur without environmental necessity. The attentional system, tuned for meaningful novelty, responds nonetheless. Over time, habitual fragmentation can influence perception of time and effort. Studies in psychology indicate that constant interruptions may increase subjective stress and reduce satisfaction with completed tasks. The body's stress response, shaped to mobilize energy during acute challenge, can activate during cognitive overload. Elevated heart rate or muscle tension may accompany perceived urgency even when no physical threat exists. Archaeological evidence of early human toolmaking reveals sustained craftsmanship requiring concentration. Stone knapping demands precision and patience, suggesting that early humans engaged in extended periods of focused work. Such activities occurred within contexts where distraction was limited. The cognitive system supporting craftsmanship likely evolved under these constraints. The rapid expansion of digital information introduces a new temporal pattern: near-continuous optional engagement. Notifications offer the possibility of immediate reward or social connection. The dopaminergic system, sensitive to unpredictable reinforcement, may respond repeatedly throughout the day. This pattern differs from ancestral reinforcement schedules tied to hunting success or seasonal harvest. The underlying circuitry remains unchanged. What shifts is the frequency and distribution of stimulation. The origin of human attention lies in environments where relevance was local and manageable. When information expands beyond immediate context and competes persistently for focus, the brain must adapt strategies to cope. Some individuals develop habits of selective filtering or intentional disengagement. Others experience difficulty maintaining sustained concentration. The question becomes how a cognitive architecture shaped for bounded streams of input interprets an environment where input rarely ceases and relevance is diffuse rather than immediate. In ancestral settings, information did not accumulate indefinitely. Once a hunting decision was made or a path chosen, attention returned to immediate surroundings. Memory preserved lessons, yet daily input remained bounded by geography and group size. The cognitive load of managing information was constrained by physical reality. Stories and knowledge were transmitted orally, often repeated within the same social circle. Repetition reinforced memory but did not multiply novelty at an accelerating rate. The brain evolved to integrate information gradually, consolidating it during sleep and periods of rest. Neural processes such as synaptic pruning and memory consolidation rely on intervals of reduced input to stabilize learning. In modern environments, the stream of information often lacks clear boundaries. News cycles refresh continuously. Digital archives preserve content indefinitely. Social interactions can resume without closure. The brain's mechanisms for consolidation still require pause, yet opportunities for uninterrupted rest may diminish when devices remain active at all hours. Research in cognitive neuroscience indicates that sleep plays a central role in integrating new information and regulating emotional responses. When exposure to stimulating content extends late into the evening, the transition into restorative sleep can be delayed. The issue is not merely quantity but persistence. In ancestral contexts, once darkness fell and social activity slowed, information input naturally declined. Modern lighting and connectivity allow engagement to continue beyond biological night. The distinction between day and evening blurs not only visually but cognitively. The emotional salience of information also shifts. In small groups, most information directly affected survival or cooperation. Modern information ecosystems include distant events, abstract risks, and opinions from unknown individuals. The amygdala and associated networks respond to emotionally charged content regardless of physical proximity. Repeated exposure to alarming or urgent narratives may sustain low-level arousal even when personal threat is minimal. This dynamic reflects evolutionary priorities. Sensitivity to potential danger increased chances of survival in unpredictable environments. When signals of danger multiply beyond immediate context, the regulatory system may struggle to calibrate response intensity appropriately. Archaeological transitions from oral to written culture expanded information storage, yet reading still required focused engagement. The digital era introduces rapid switching and constant refresh. The brain, shaped to seek novelty as a survival strategy, encounters novelty at a frequency historically unparalleled. This does not imply inevitable harm, but it underscores the scale of change. The origin of human cognition lies in landscapes where information flowed through direct encounter and resolved within the same environment. Modern life extends that flow across distance and time, reducing natural stopping points. The confusion arises when systems designed for intermittent learning operate within a field of perpetual update. The deeper question becomes how a mind shaped by cycles of engagement and rest interprets a world where engagement is always available and rest must be deliberately chosen. For most of human evolution, comfort was temporary and earned through effort. Shelter provided protection from wind and rain, yet it rarely insulated completely from temperature or sound. Fire offered warmth, but it required gathering fuel and constant attention. Soft resting surfaces were constructed from available materials such as animal hides, grasses, or earth. These arrangements reduced hardship without eliminating it. The body adapted within this balance. Muscles recovered on uneven ground. Joints adjusted to natural contours. Sleep occurred within spaces where slight discomfort signaled posture change rather than immobility. The absence of total comfort maintained subtle engagement between body and environment. Archaeological evidence from Paleolithic campsites reveals hearths surrounded by simple structures, indicating communal efforts to improve living conditions. Yet these improvements remain constrained by resource availability and physical labor. Comfort existed, but it was partial and dynamic. The agricultural revolution introduced more permanent dwellings, and over time, architecture improved insulation and protection. Even so, until recent centuries, homes were subject to drafts, seasonal cold and variable lighting. Furniture evolved gradually, yet prolonged sedentary luxury remained rare for most of the population. Industrialization and technological advancement transformed the scale of comfort. Cushioned seating, climate control, abundant food, and digital entertainment created environments optimized to reduce physical friction. Effort became increasingly optional. Elevators replaced stairs, vehicles replaced walking, processed foods required minimal preparation. This transformation brought undeniable benefits, including reduced physical strain and increased lifespan in many regions. However, the human body evolved within conditions where comfort followed exertion and was balanced by environmental challenge. The reward systems of the brain reflect this pattern. Dopaminergic pathways reinforce behaviors that lead to relief or satisfaction after effort. When comfort becomes constant and detached from exertion, these pathways may operate differently. Research in behavioral science suggests that excessive ease can alter motivation patterns, though interpretations vary. From a physiological perspective, Moderate physical stress such as exercise, temperature variation, or intermittent fasting can stimulate adaptive responses known as hormesis. These responses enhance resilience by engaging repair and maintenance mechanisms. In ancestral contexts, such stresses were routine. Modern life often reduces exposure to mild stress while protecting against extreme harm. The evolutionary origin of resilience lies in fluctuating challenge rather than steady ease. Muscles strengthen under load. Bones increase density with repeated impact. Cardiovascular capacity improves with sustained effort. When these stimuli diminish, maintenance processes adjust accordingly. The body does not deteriorate immediately. It adapts to lower demand. The confusion arises when inherited systems continue to expect cycles of exertion and recovery within environments that minimize both. Early Homo sapiens navigated landscapes where rest followed movement and warmth followed labor. Comfort marked temporary relief, not permanent state. The modern pursuit of continuous ease represents a historical shift occurring within a few generations. The question is not whether comfort is desirable, but how a physiology shaped by intermittent challenge interprets a world designed to remove nearly all friction. In ancestral environments, effort was woven into nearly every necessary action. To obtain water required walking to a river or spring. To prepare food required grinding, cutting, and tending fire. To travel required endurance across uneven ground. These efforts were not perceived as optional exertion. They were embedded within daily survival. The body evolved within this continuous interaction between demand and relief. Muscle contraction stimulated circulation. Mechanical load signaled bone maintenance. Periods of rest followed fatigue that arose naturally from prior movement. Recovery was not a separate category. It was the other half of a balanced cycle. Archaeological evidence from early settlements shows wear patterns on tools and skeletal markers of repetitive labor, indicating that exertion was a defining feature of existence. Modern environments alter this balance by separating effort from necessity. Many tasks once requiring physical input now require minimal movement. Water flows through pipes. Food arrives packaged. Transportation reduces walking distance to negligible amounts. The human nervous system still associates effort with reward because that association was adaptive for millennia. When effort diminishes, reward pathways may seek alternative stimulation. Research in motivational psychology suggests that humans derive satisfaction from overcoming manageable challenge. This phenomenon aligns with evolutionary logic. Success in ancestral contexts often required skill development and persistence. The brain's reward systems evolved to reinforce behaviors that increased competence and survival probability. When comfort is constant and obstacles minimal, opportunities for natural challenge may decline. This does not imply that modern life lacks difficulty. Cognitive and social challenges remain abundant. However, the physical component of challenge, once inseparable from survival, may recede. Physiological stresses such as moderate cold, heat, or exertion can activate repair mechanisms, including mitochondrial biogenesis and antioxidant production. These adaptive responses reflect a design optimized for fluctuation rather than steady equilibrium. Excessive stress can harm, yet absence of moderate stress may reduce resilience. The concept of hormesis captures this principle. Low-level stress can strengthen systems that would weaken under total absence of stimulus. In ancestral settings, such stress was unavoidable. The environment delivered it through terrain, weather, and resource variability. In contemporary settings, many stresses can be avoided entirely. Climate control eliminates temperature fluctuation. Processed food reduces digestive effort. Sedentary work reduces mechanical load. The body adapts to reduced demand by conserving energy and adjusting baseline function. Over time, muscles may atrophy if unused, and metabolic rate may shift to match lower activity. These changes reflect adaptation rather than malfunction. The origin of human physiology lies in a landscape of effort punctuated by rest. Comfort marked completion of work or safety from immediate threat. When comfort becomes default rather than relief, the body's interpretive framework shifts. The deeper question becomes how systems shaped by alternating strain and recovery interpret a world where strain is optional and recovery continuous. In ancestral life, comfort followed completion. A successful hunt concluded with shared warmth and food. A long journey ended with rest near water or shelter. Relief had context because it emerged from prior demand. This sequence shaped emotional expectation. Satisfaction was tied to tangible effort and observable outcome. The neurochemical systems underlying reward, including dopamine and endogenous opioids, likely evolved to reinforce actions that increase survival probability. When effort preceded comfort, the contrast heightened its value. In modern environments, many forms of comfort are available independent of physical exertion. Climate control, soft furnishings, instant entertainment, and readily accessible food provide relief without preceding strain. The reward system continues to operate according to inherited associations, yet the pattern of activation shifts. Studies in behavioral neuroscience indicate that reward circuits respond not only to outcome, but to anticipation and effort. When effort diminishes, anticipation may seek alternative stimulation, sometimes through novelty or consumption detached from necessity. This dynamic does not suggest moral decline. It reflects a mismatch between biological expectation and environmental design. The body's stress response evolved to mobilize energy in the face of challenge, then to subside during recovery. In ancestral contexts, recovery required genuine safety and rest. When comfort is continuous, stress may arise from abstract sources rather than physical demand. Cognitive stressors such as deadlines or social evaluation can activate physiological arousal without accompanying movement. Without physical discharge, the body may experience sustained tension. Research suggests that moderate physical exertion can buffer psychological stress by engaging cardiovascular and musculoskeletal systems in ways that align with evolutionary design. When physical challenge is scarce, opportunities for such buffering decrease. Archaeological evidence from early settlements shows communal spaces organized around shared labor and rest. Even in complex societies, daily routines required bodily engagement with environment. The modern separation between work, exercise, and leisure represents a historical novelty. Exercise is scheduled rather than inherent. Leisure often involves passive consumption rather than recovery from physical fatigue. The body's regulatory systems, shaped by oscillation between strain and relief, continue to expect that rhythm. When relief becomes baseline, its signaling value diminishes. Comfort loses contrast. The organism adapts to lower levels of demand, yet the architecture of resilience may not receive regular stimulation. This does not mean that modern life inevitably weakens the body. It suggests that intentional reintroduction of moderate challenge may align more closely with inherited patterns. The origin of human physiology lies in landscapes where effort was unavoidable and comfort transient. Early Homo sapiens rested on uneven ground under shifting skies. Their satisfaction was measured by survival and shared success. Modern environments offer safety and convenience unprecedented in history. The question becomes how a nervous system evolved to interpret comfort as earned, interprets a world where comfort is constant and strain optional. For nearly all of human existence, environmental change unfolded slowly relative to the lifespan of a single individual. Climatic shifts occurred across centuries or millennia. Cultural practices evolved gradually within localized regions. Genetic adaptation operated over many generations through natural selection acting on reproductive success. Early Homo sapiens inherited physiological traits shaped by ancestral conditions and passed them forward with only incremental modification. Archaeological sequences reveal continuity in tool forms and settlement patterns that changed gradually rather than abruptly. This tempo allowed biological systems to remain aligned with environmental pressures. When a population migrated into colder climates, traits supporting thermoregulation and energy conservation increased in frequency over extended periods. When dietary patterns shifted toward agriculture, genetic variants influencing lactose tolerance or starch digestion rose gradually in certain groups. Evolution responded, but it required time. The pace of technological and social transformation in the last few centuries differs markedly from this historical rhythm. Industrialization altered work patterns, food production, transportation, and urban structure within a handful of generations. Digital technology reshaped communication within decades. From an evolutionary perspective, these intervals are extremely brief. The human genome has not undergone widespread redesign to accommodate artificial lighting, sedentary work, or constant connectivity. While microevolutionary changes can occur relatively quickly under strong selective pressures, most complex physiological systems remain anchored in adaptations forged under pre-industrial conditions. This disparity creates a gap between biological tempo and cultural acceleration. The concept of evolutionary mismatch describes situations in which traits once advantageous under ancestral conditions become less adaptive in new environments. For example, preference for energy-dense foods supported survival when calories were scarce. In contexts of abundance, the same preference may contribute to metabolic strain. The underlying trait did not change, the environment did. Archaeological and genetic evidence demonstrates that adaptation can occur when environmental pressures persist across many generations. However, when environments transform faster than genetic selection can operate, individuals rely on plasticity rather than evolution. Physiological plasticity allows short-term adjustment through changes in gene expression, hormone levels, and behavior, yet plasticity operates within inherited limits. When demands exceed those limits, strain may emerge. It is important to note that humans possess remarkable adaptability. Migration across continents, survival in diverse climates, and cultural innovation reflect resilience. The issue is not incapacity but timing. Early Homo sapiens adapted to gradual environmental gradients. Modern populations navigate rapid technological gradients that compress change into single lifetimes. This compression means that children and grandparents may inhabit markedly different sensory and social worlds. The body's regulatory systems, calibrated over millennia, must interpret novel stimuli without the benefit of generational genetic adjustment. The origin of human physiology lies in slow adaptation to stable patterns. The modern world introduces rapid novelty layered upon that foundation. The deeper question becomes how long biological systems can rely solely on plasticity before cultural pace consistently outruns physiological expectation. Across evolutionary time, adaptation depended on differential survival and reproduction. Traits that improved fitness under specific environmental pressures gradually increased in frequency. This process required many generations and relatively stable conditions. For early Homo sapiens, selective pressures included climate, pathogen exposure, food availability, and social cooperation within small groups. Genetic variants supporting efficient energy storage, robust immune response, or endurance locomotion conferred advantage in those contexts. Archaeological and genomic evidence indicates that even well-documented adaptations, such as lactose tolerance in certain pastoralist populations, unfolded over thousands of years after the domestication of animals. The tempo of change allowed physiology to track environment within limits. Modern environmental shifts operate on shorter timelines. Urbanization, industrial diets, artificial light exposure, and digital communication have transformed daily life within a few centuries, sometimes within decades. From the perspective of genetic selection, this interval is insufficient for widespread structural redesign. Most individuals alive today carry genomes nearly identical to those of ancestors who lived before industrialization. While epigenetic mechanisms can modulate gene expression in response to environment, these modifications do not alter underlying sequence and may not persist reliably across multiple generations. Plasticity provides flexibility but not wholesale adaptation. Consider dietary change. High intake of refined sugars and processed fats became common only in the last century for many populations. Metabolic systems evolved under scarcity may respond by storing excess energy, a strategy advantageous in unpredictable environments. In modern contexts where excess persists, the same strategy can contribute to chronic metabolic conditions. This does not represent failure of design. It reflects continuity of inherited function under altered conditions. Similarly, circadian systems evolved under solar cycles encounter artificial light and irregular schedules. Short-term adjustment is possible, yet complete reconfiguration across populations has not occurred. Archaeological transitions from nomadic to agricultural life illustrate that cultural shifts can outpace biological adaptation. Skeletal remains from early farming communities show evidence of nutritional stress and increased disease burden compared to some preceding hunter-gatherer groups. Over time, genetic and cultural adjustments mitigated some of these effects. However, the process required generations. The modern acceleration of change compresses similar transitions into periods shorter than a typical lifespan. The body relies heavily on behavioral modification to bridge this gap. Public health recommendations encourage exercise, balanced diet, and sleep hygiene as compensatory strategies. These recommendations often reintroduce elements resembling ancestral patterns. The underlying implication is that physiology remains oriented toward earlier conditions. The evolutionary origin of human biology lies in stable pressures, acting slowly. When pressures shift rapidly, adaptation depends less on genetic change and more on conscious adjustment. The deeper question concerns sustainability. Can plasticity and behavioral adaptation indefinitely compensate for environmental acceleration, or will certain mismatches persist as enduring features of modern life? Across evolutionary history, the gap between environment and biology has rarely closed completely, yet it has seldom widened as quickly as it has in recent centuries. Early Homo sapiens encountered gradual shifts in climate, migration routes, and resource distribution. When environments changed, generations followed one another under similar pressures, allowing natural selection to adjust traits slowly. Genetic variation supporting new conditions increased incrementally, while less adaptive variants declined. This pattern required stability over time. When agriculture altered diet and settlement, adaptation unfolded across thousands of years, evidenced by genomic signatures in populations that domesticated animals or relied heavily on starch. The pace of cultural innovation in the modern era compresses similar transformations into decades. Children born into digital societies inhabit sensory and social landscapes dramatically different from those of their grandparents. Urbanization, industrial food systems, artificial lighting, and global connectivity converge within single lifespans. The biological systems regulating sleep, metabolism, stress, and social cognition remain largely continuous with those of pre-industrial ancestors. While gene expression can shift through epigenetic mechanisms in response to environment, such modulation does not equate to structural redesign. Plasticity offers flexibility, but it operates within inherited architecture. When environmental change accelerates beyond the timescale of genetic adaptation, individuals rely on learning and behavior to compensate. Public health strategies often encourage reintroduction of elements resembling ancestral conditions: regular movement, balanced diet, exposure to natural light, and social connection within manageable groups. These recommendations implicitly acknowledge the enduring influence of evolutionary design. Archaeological transitions reveal that when mismatch persists across generations, gradual adjustment may follow. Yet the speed of current change raises questions about whether cultural adaptation can consistently align with biological expectation. Human resilience is evident in our ability to inhabit diverse climates and create complex societies. However, resilience does not eliminate constraint. Physiological systems evolve to manage variation within certain bounds. When stimuli exceed those bounds persistently, strain may accumulate. This strain can manifest differently across individuals depending on genetics, early development, and environment. The origin of human biology lies in landscapes that shifted slowly, offering time for adaptation. Modern life introduces layered novelty at a rate unmatched in evolutionary memory. The confusion experienced by the human body does not arise from fragility, but from fidelity to ancient design. Systems that once ensured survival continue to operate as if environmental signals align with ancestral patterns. The deeper question is whether cultural awareness and intentional behavior can bridge the widening gap between biological tempo and technological acceleration, or whether mismatch will remain a defining feature of the human condition in the centuries ahead. When we gather the threads of light, food, movement, temperature, sound, society, time, information, and comfort, a pattern becomes visible. The human body was not assembled for a single location, but it was shaped within a single tempo. That tempo was slow, cyclical, and bounded by natural constraint. Early Homo sapiens did not design their environment. They adapted to it. Their physiology was written in conversation with wind, hunger, distance, and darkness. Each regulatory system, circadian rhythm, metabolism, stress response, immune function, evolved in coherence with recurring patterns that remained stable across generations. The world changed, but it changed gradually enough for biology to track it. Modern life introduces a different dynamic. The environment is increasingly designed rather than encountered. Light is extended, food is stabilized, temperature is selected, sound is amplified. Social scale expands beyond immediate recognition. Time becomes standardized and forward-driving. Information flows continuously. Comfort becomes default rather than relief. None of these changes are inherently harmful. Many have reduced suffering, extended lifespan, and increased opportunity. Yet each introduces signals that differ from those present at the origin of our species. The body interprets those signals using ancient frameworks. It does not know that artificial light is safe, or that digital evaluation carries no direct survival threat. It processes input according to patterns shaped across millennia. Archaeological evidence reminds us that adaptation once unfolded slowly. The transition from nomadic bands to agricultural villages spanned thousands of years. The shift from village to industrial city unfolded more rapidly, yet still across generations. The digital transformation compresses similar change into decades. Children born today may encounter sensory and social environments fundamentally different from those experienced by their parents. Biological systems, however, remain continuous across this divide. The concept of mismatch does not imply that modern life is incompatible with human survival. It suggests that tension arises when inherited expectations meet novel conditions. Some individuals may navigate this tension with relative ease, supported by genetic variation and social context. Others may experience strain in sleep, metabolism, or mood regulation. The variation reflects diversity in biology interacting with diversity in environment. The origin of our physiology lies in open landscapes where effort and rest alternated naturally, where seasons marked time, and where social groups remained small. The present environment offers safety and complexity unprecedented in history. The body stands between these two worlds. It carries the memory of ancient cycles while inhabiting designed systems. The question is not whether we can return to the past. It is whether we can understand the origins of our design well enough to navigate the present with greater alignment. Understanding this tension does not require rejection of modern life. It requires recognition of origin. The human body is not malfunctioning when it struggles with irregular sleep under artificial light or when appetite persists in environments of abundance. It is responding according to instructions written long before electric grids and digital networks. Those instructions were formed when survival depended on reading subtle changes in sky and soil, when hunger followed effort, and when silence returned each night. The concept of confusion emerges because signals have changed faster than design. Light no longer guarantees day. Abundance no longer guarantees future scarcity. Social evaluation no longer comes only from those who share physical space. Time advances without seasonal pause. Information arrives without boundary. Comfort persists without preceding strain. The body interprets these signals using systems shaped across hundreds of thousands of years. It does not possess a separate code for industrial modernity. Yet awareness offers a different form of adaptation. While genetic evolution unfolds slowly, cultural understanding can shift within a lifetime. Exposure to natural light during the day, deliberate movement woven back into routine, moments of quiet without digital interruption, seasonal awareness even within cities, and intentional social boundaries can partially realign external patterns with internal expectation. These adjustments do not restore ancient landscapes, but they acknowledge biological continuity. Archaeological evidence reminds us that humans have repeatedly navigated transitions by blending innovation with inherited practice. Early farmers retained elements of foraging. Urban societies preserved communal rituals rooted in older traditions. Adaptation has always involved negotiation between change and continuity. The present moment extends that negotiation into new domains. The human body carries deep memory of cyclical rhythm, manageable social scale, and environmental variability. Modern life offers safety, longevity, and opportunity unparalleled in prehistory. The tension between these realities need not be framed as failure. It can be understood as dialogue between ancient physiology and contemporary design. The educational value of this perspective lies in shifting blame away from individual weakness and toward historical context. When fatigue, distraction, or restlessness appear, they may signal misalignment rather than defect. Recognizing origin allows for gentler response. It invites deliberate pacing within acceleration, deliberate rest within constant connectivity. Early Homo sapiens survived by attuning to their environment with care. That capacity remains. The question that lingers is not whether modern life will slow to match our biology, but whether we can learn to shape our habits so that the ancient body within us feels less like a stranger in the world it now inhabits. If we step back far enough, beyond cities and screens, beyond industry and electricity, we find a simpler image. A small group gathered at the edge of open land. The sky darkens gradually, air cools, voices soften, the body slows without instruction. No clock announces the hour, no notification interrupts the quiet. Light fades, and with it, the day's demands. In that setting, physiology and environment move together. Sleep comes because darkness arrives. Hunger returns because effort was spent. Warmth feels earned because cold was real. Nothing is optimized, yet everything is aligned. That alignment shaped the architecture of the human body across hundreds of thousands of years. The modern world does not resemble that landscape, and it does not need to. It has extended safety, reduced mortality, and expanded possibility in ways unimaginable to our ancestors. The question is not whether progress should reverse. It is whether awareness can accompany progress. When we understand that fatigue under artificial light reflects circadian heritage, or that restlessness after prolonged sitting reflects a body built for distance, we shift perspective. Strain becomes signal. Discomfort becomes information. The body is not confused without reason. It is responding to patterns that once meant survival. Early Homo sapiens endured cold nights and uncertain hunts, yet their physiology rarely faced the velocity of change that defines the present. The gap between ancient design and modern environment is unlikely to disappear. It may widen as technology advances, yet the capacity for reflection, planning, and cultural adaptation is also part of our evolutionary inheritance. We can choose light that respects darkness. We can move deliberately within enclosed spaces. We can create pauses within streams of information. These choices do not erase modernity, but they acknowledge origin. The deeper insight is not that the body is flawed, nor that the world is wrong. It is that both were shaped under different conditions. The human organism carries memory of cycles older than cities. It carries rhythms older than clocks. As the night settles in whatever place you are listening, consider this. If your body still listens for signals written in ancient landscapes, what small changes might allow those signals to be heard again in the world you now inhabit?